is on you guys. Taylor.
What were insular cases again?
Louder.
Insular cases?
The insular cases. Series of Supreme Court cases. And the metaphorical question was, who remembers? Nobody. Awesome.
Constitution thing? Where it does the Constitution follow?
Follow what?
Follow the flag.
Does it follow the flag? So if we take possession of a territory by whatever means, does that automatically apply constitutional protections to the people who live there? And the answer in those cases was no. Although Congress almost always extended constitutional protections anyways by law. But the point is, it wasn't automatic. So this is a matter that comes up when? Louder, please. During the imperialist or expansionist phase, around the time of the Spanish-American War, when we're picking up more possessions in the islands. Island, hence insular. That's what insular refers to. All right? Booker.
What was the freedom of conscience idea?
Freedom of conscience or liberty of conscience, that's a very old term that means essentially freedom of religion. So anytime you're talking about freedom of religion, way, way back, they may use the term freedom of conscience. For example, one of the documents we were looking at yesterday in another class, Roger Williams spoke about liberty of conscience. He was talking about the ability of people to practice religion as they saw fit. All right, good session.
If nobody else has a question,
Yes, sir, Colin.
could you talk a bit about Latin American intervention? Like how America intervened in Latin America?
Let's talk about a few examples, okay? Now, do we want to include Mexico? I mean, it's Latin America, but sometimes people mean south of Mexico.
Sure.
Okay. Our first dealings with Mexico go back as far as Texas, right? They announced, the Mexican government says, 1820s, they're going to start allowing Americans to settle in Texas. Two conditions. Number one, no slavery. We ignored that. Number two, anybody who moves here has to convert to Catholicism. We ignored that. So the Americans living in Texas eventually foment a revolt starting in 1836. They'll break away. They're going to call themselves a separate nation, the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic, if you will. Mexico says what?
Used to belong to us.
Now, Mexico claimed that Texas was still part of Mexico, but they weren't going to do anything about it because they didn't want to risk additional war with the United States.
No, you're fine. I'm just trying to grab my stuff without like dumping it all on you.
Where was I? Okay, so eventually, a few years passed, we get to 1845. Andrew Jackson had not wanted Texas to join the Union on his watch because he didn't want to put up with the headache of the argument over slavery. That was part of his concern. But eventually, 1845 comes along. Texas joins the Union, partly because the Democrats, led by Polk, had campaigned on it in 1844. Then they took his victory as a signal to annex Texas. So Texas joins. It's the biggest state in the Union. Our border now goes to the Rio Grande, and it's another big slave state. Okay? We'll go to war with Mexico because starting the next year, 1846, we'll go to war with Mexico because
We goaded them into shooting us.
that's the immediate cause. That's the proximate cause. But I mean, why? Just for kicks? Partly for kicks, but mostly for
Slave state. The South wanted slave states.
slave states, for land, extra land. We want to get to the Pacific. It's partly about expanding slavery. It is partly about manifest destiny. Okay? So we pick up the Mexican cession, which brings us all the way out to California, right? We throw in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Did that come up today? Yeah. We get the Mexican cession. We throw Mexico a little bit of cash. There had been the Wilmot Proviso, the argument, which was the failed attempt to ban slavery from the Mexican cession. And now that we get all this land, there's going to be arguments about expanding into that area, okay? And whether it's going to be slave territory, free slave territory. Okay, so that's Mexico. There are a couple other attempts. There had been some talk about building a canal through Nicaragua. That got ruled out. We signed a treaty with Britain in 1850 saying that we're not going to try to build we're not going to try and build a canal through there. And then 50 years later, of course, we're going to have the Panama Canal. We're going to do that treaty that allows us to build the Panama Canal. There was some thought of a second war with Mexico during the 1860s, very briefly at the end of the Civil War, because France had gained influence in Mexico. Then we were dealing with Napoleon III down there. It flamed out. There was never a second war against Mexico. Starting in the 1880s, 1890s, we started becoming much more interested in Latin America because what? Money, financial relationships. We're looking to expand our geopolitical imprint, or footprint, so to speak. We're interested in eventually setting up a canal through Central America that will make Atlantic Pacific traffic much simpler, much less expensive. I know I'm leaving stuff out along the ways. Fast forward a little bit, get to the 1900s. We're getting increasingly interested in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua as well. Of course, we start building the Panama Canal. In 1904, we got them to break away from, Panama. From Colombia. They're right next door to Colombia, right? So they break away from Colombia, set up a new country, allow us to build a canal through there, right? And we're going to own and operate the canal up until 99. So for almost 100 years. Well, some people aren't happy about this down in Latin America because it shows that America's getting more influence. And just as they didn't like the idea of being dominated by major European powers, they're also not happy about the potential for being dominated by their northern brethren, by the United States, right? 1910s, early 1910s, there's a Mexican Civil War that we are tangentially involved in. Pancho Villa keeps trying to drag us into the war by making attacks across the Rio Grande. Wilson wants to stay out of the war, but he's also not happy about the progress of the Mexican Civil War. That's all interrupted by World War I. Wilson sends troops to Haiti, to the Dominican Republic, to try and keep that area under control. Roosevelt had his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine saying that we reserve the right to intervene militarily or financially in these Latin American countries if they ever got into trouble, because we didn't want Europe floating over here and claiming that they were allowed to take over a country. I'm running out of breath.
Okay.
There's more to it, but let me stop there for now and change subjects.
Thank you.
Could you name some major progressive domestic reforms?
Okay, progressive domestic reforms. First of all, who are the progressive presidents? The ones that we specifically call progressives. You can call later ones progressive too, but the big names are, which Roosevelt? Teddy Roosevelt. Taft, remember, was pretty conservative. He did a couple progressive things, but by comparison to Roosevelt, he was conservative. And who's the guy after Taft? Woodrow Wilson. Those are the two big progressive presidents. All right, yeah. Alex, is this different?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'm gonna be nice today. I'm gonna try.
All right. Now, some of the big laws that they got passed, okay? We'll come to constitutional amendments in a little bit. What were the overall goals of the progressives?
One of them was consumer safety.
You'll have to speak up.
One of them was consumer safety.
Okay, consumer protection, consumer safety. What else? Getting who under control?
Monopoly.
Getting the big monopolies and trusts under control. What else?
Underage rights.
Louder, please.
Women's rights.
Women's rights. They were kind of back and forth on African American rights. Some of them were very much in favor of African American rights. Some of them, Wilson himself, not so much. Let's start there. Let's start with consumer protection, okay? This especially becomes important after Sinclair publishes The Jungle. We're going to see the Food and Drug Act. We're going to see the Meat Inspection Act, right? We're going to see Teddy Roosevelt pushing for environmental legislation and reserving more areas as wildlife reserves, national parks, so on and so forth. We're going to see some democratic reform, not just, well, at the city levels, there's more democracy being introduced, but also at the federal level. We're going to see the Senate now elected directly by the people as a result of the 17th Amendment during Wilson's time. We're going to see women get the right to vote, 1919, 1920, the 19th Amendment. We're going to see a move away from the tariff and towards the income tax. Because remember, the tariff, they argued, hit everybody, especially the poor. The income tax would hit the rich. And so with the 16th Amendment, we see passage of the income tax. They start...
Sorry.
That's okay.
What president was that?
I can't hear you.
What president?
It's under Wilson that all these amendments, that the 4th Amendment gets passed. 16 is the income tax. He lowers the tariff, he raises an income tax. 17th was direct election of the senators. 18th was prohibition. 19th was women's right to vote. Now that all happens during Wilson's time in office, even though the president does not directly, does not have a specific legal role in amending the Constitution. All he can do is cheerlead.
Okay.
What else? What else? Roosevelt took the side of unions against big businesses for it was the first time a president had done that. Roosevelt signed some laws that made it a little bit easier for agencies of the federal government to regulate railroads, like the Mann-Elkins Act, stuff like that. All right. What else? What else? What else? Wilson signed, I forget the name of the law, but he helped create the Federal Reserve System in an effort to try and get the currency under control. He passed a new, stronger antitrust act called, not the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, which specifically exempted unions and specifically exempted farm cooperatives. So there's more to the list, but if you hit those items, and if you can categorize them, social, economic, political, or political and socioeconomic, you're in good shape. But the overall goal, more democracy, getting businesses under control.
Can you briefly go over the major Supreme Court cases?
This list probably won't be chronological, but let's talk about some of the big ones, okay? The first big one, hold on, you guys stay quiet. Alex, Monique, you stay quiet, okay? Watch, I warned you, I told you. Marbury versus Madison?
Judicial review.
Now the rest of it. Marbury versus Madison, which is the power of the Supreme Court to determine whether something is constitutional or not. It's a really big deal because they had to get out and stake that claim because it's not mentioned in the Constitution at all. But the other reason Marshall pushed for it is because he wanted to make the federal government stronger. And if they give themselves the power to decide what's in the Constitution and what's not, then they've got the ultimate, the final say in our government, so to speak, rather than the states having. Okay, so Marbury versus Madison is the first big one. Let's see, we could mention McCulloch versus Maryland, another M versus M case, if you will, which I think that one is on your term sheet. That one has to do with confirming, if you will, that the Bank of the United States is a constitutional application of the implied powers clause. So it protects the bank for the time being before Jackson kills it. But it also confirms that Congress and the President can use implied powers and stretch out that elastic clause or necessary and proper clause more. Okay, so that's about 1919. That whole martial court, the first third of the 1800s, every decision that guy makes is aimed at making the national government stronger at the expense of the state governments. Okay, so either it makes the federal government stronger or it makes the state governments weaker, all right? Worcester v. Georgia, that's the one where he says, hey, the states have to allow the Cherokees to stay. That's the one that Andrew Jackson ignores. Does what he wants anyways, but thankfully, that does not become a lasting precedent for presidents. Let's see, a little bit later.
Wow.
That's a lot later. We'll get
You
there.
said it.
I'm sorry, I don't know where was I? Let's say Prigg v. Pennsylvania, 1844. Said that personal liberty laws are unconstitutional. Those are the laws that the North passed to try to get out of the fugitive slave laws. The Supreme Court said, sorry guys, you can't do that. And guys, if you can think of any I'm leaving out as I go chronologically, please, we'll get there. I promise. That's okay, that's okay. Dred Scott, the one that said African Americans are not citizens, that Congress did not have the power to ban slavery from any territory, infuriated the North, helped contribute to the Civil War. Fast forward to, let's see, 1877 or so, we get Munn versus Illinois, which said that states are allowed to, has to do with the choo-choos. They can regulate intrastate commerce like the railroads as long as it's within their state. A few years later, Wabash versus Illinois said, remember, within your state, not from state to state. So Wabash says states cannot regulate trains that go from state to state. I'm leaving anything out before I get to Plessy. There were the slaughterhouse cases in the 1870s that kind of weakened the 14th Amendment, made discrimination by private citizens and individuals in states a little bit easier. 1896, we get the Plessy v. Ferguson. Now, who mentioned Plessy a minute ago? What was Plessy?
Separate but equal.
Separate but equal. Remember, Plessy was Rosa Parks on a railroad car, in a railroad car. Refused to leave the white-only car. Got arrested, goes to the Supreme Court, loses. So we've got separate but equal, and Plessy strengthens Jim Crow. All right? We mentioned the insular cases a little bit earlier. Monique, you all right there?
Yeah.
Sweet. We mentioned the insular cases a little bit earlier, right? Those are the late 1890s, early 1900s. We've got Lochner versus New York, which said,
Wasn't that about the government monopoly and bridges?
that's Charles River.
Oh.
That's a lot earlier. I could have mentioned that one, I guess, but remind me that you said that when I get to the end of the chronology. Lochner was the one that said that New York State could not limit the hours that the bakers work. It was an anti-progressive law, if you will. It was a pro-free market law. All right? But then a couple years later was the Muller case. My guys should remember talking about Muller in the last couple days. Muller versus Oregon. Factories.
When they couldn't, it's like they couldn't work, the amount of hours they would work.
It was legal to restrict the number of hours women work. And the rationale for doing that at the time, I know it sounds foreign to us today, but progressives at the time applauded that decision because it protected women. You know, their dainty little flowers and blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, back then, it was welcomed by progressives. Today, probably not so Let's see, that's 1908. 19. Said that you could regulate speech if it, you could restrict speech if it presented,
I think that's national security.
louder?
I think that's national security.
Okay, but how did they phrase it? Remember, the guy gets thrown in jail for what? Kevin, I'm coming right back to you in a second. He gets thrown in jail for what? For criticizing,
The war.
not just criticizing the war effort, but also telling people to dodge the draft, right? Kevin, you were going to say, you had a hand up. I saw it, you had a hand up.
Restricted speech if you were an immediate threat.
They didn't say immediate, they said clear and present danger. Now, that's different from an immediate threat, which is somebody's like about to punch you, right? Or somebody's about to shoot you. They were worried that people, because of reading this pamphlet, might decide to dodge the draft. Now, how often that actually happened? Probably not very often. So, that's a pretty big restriction on speech that they'll have to go back later and loosen up a little bit. 1920s, the Taft court, he's a bit more conservative. 1930s, that conservative court left over from the 20s rules a lot of New Deal programs to be unconstitutional. And that's when FDR threatens to pack the court, which doesn't work. The sick chicken case is in there, Schechter v. U.S., and that's the turning point where now FDR says, okay, I'm going to pack the court, but it doesn't work. But nonetheless, he's able to put people on the Supreme Court as they retire and make the court more liberal and more receptive to the New Deal. We get the 44, middle of the war. Oh, wait a minute.
What's the sick?
I can't hear you.
The sick ticket?
What was it?
Oh, Schechter v. U.S.? You remember we talked about the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, with the Blue Eagle? Does that ring a bell? And they were telling companies, hey, you know, if you're on board with the recovery, you have to join and you have to put up these, you have to put up the Blue Eagle. If you don't have the Blue Eagle, you're going to get harassed and all that stuff. They said, hey, you're going to charge these prices that we tell you to charge. You're going to be open these hours. You're going to pay these wages, so on and so forth. Well, somebody said, wait a minute. Where's the authority for Congress to do that? It goes to the Supreme Court. And remember, this is still a pretty conservative Supreme Court. It's Taft's court, even though Taft is gone by this point. And in that case, they say NRA, unconstitutional. In another case, they say the Agricultural Act. Remember that one? They're paying people to plow up their field. They say that's unconstitutional. And that's when FDR starts pushing for more people who are New Deal friendly to be on the court. Does that help? Okay, what about the exterior? Do I need to worry about this one, so I can yell that?
But it's got the panic bars on there, so you have to keep it. That's the reason I don't even want that.
Okay, so I don't have to worry about it. All right, thank you very
If
much.
they go out that way, you might want to check in the church.
Nobody's going out that way. Thank you, Ms. Chapman.
Very well.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you, Mr.
Allen.
Everybody here must get at least a 4 and preferably a 5 on your AP, and I'm gonna check. Some of you I can check. I'm gonna check you all.
Sorry to disappoint you.
Okay. You ready?
We were at Schechter.
Yeah, like FDR was in the Supreme Court.
Oh, okay. Next, let's look at 44, Korematsu.
That is unconstitutional to the
Because,
during the time of war.
tell you what, would it be okay if everybody just sat over here, since this appears to be it? And we'll get the cone here. And the court says it's constitutional because A, it's a declared war, and that means civil liberties are restrictable. Again, not our proudest moment, but what can you do? Although, again, it was possible to sue for release from the prisons, although they legally weren't prisons, they were internment camps. Although that, as I understand it, was very rare. We talked a little bit about, let's see, somewhere in 44, there's a court case where they throw out the white primary, the white-only primary, right? Smith versus Allred, I think. Around 1950 or so, there's the court case where they kept Truman from nationalizing the steel mills, the Youngstown sheet case. Now, in 1954, you brought it up earlier. I think
Oh, Brown.
Oh, that was him.
that was, you were blessing.
Yeah.
Brown v. Board of Education, separate is inherently unequal. Louder, please.
So just like the opposite of
It overturns Plessy. That's exactly right. Now, it's going to be a good 10 years before they really get around to enforcing that law, or excuse me, that decision, but at least the decision's been made, 9-0, 9-0. Now, the cases are going to start to get jumbled time-wise a little bit in the 60s because there are a lot that come up. Now, there aren't going to be a whole lot of questions about these cases, but, you know, maybe 3 at most. But it can still help, right? What's the cop show litany? You get arrested. What do they tell you? And I'm going to pause you as you say it, okay?
You have the
You're
right
right.
to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have
But-
the right.
Held.
Time out. Now, what you said so far, that's the Miranda decision.
Yeah, and that's what I thought it was on the test that we took today, but it's
I'm sorry, speak up.
we had a test on this today, and I thought I put Miranda, but then I changed it last minute.
What did you change it to?
I forgot, but it wasn't.
Oh, okay, well, hold on. Miranda says that you have to be told your rights specifically to protect you from accidentally incriminating yourself, testifying against yourself, okay? Now keep going with the arrest instructions. You left off at anything you say can be used against you.
In the court of law, you have the right to an attorney.
Stop. You have the right to an attorney and to have him present with you during questioning. That's Escobedo. Is that the one you wrote? And then and all of these are in the 60s. And the last part is,
You cannot afford an attorney that won't be appointed to you.
and that's Gideon versus Wainwright, which says that if you are indigent, you can't afford an attorney, the state will provide one for you. Okay? So those 3 deal with defendants' rights under the Warren Court. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, right? 65, Griswold v. Connecticut. Actually, I'd be surprised if that showed up, but Griswold v. Connecticut says the right to use birth control is protected by the right to privacy. It's one of the first prominent times we see the right to privacy show up. We get some court cases that protect freedom of religion, that stop forced public school prayer. Again, guys, in public school, you can pray all you want as long as it's not disruptive. It's just that the school can't make you do it.
This is like in the later 60s, the prayer.
That particular one was 62-ish maybe, Engel versus Vitale, or maybe it was a little bit later, 62 or so. 1973, we're on to a different court now. 1973, Roe v. Wade, which combined with Doe gives a virtually unlimited right to abortion. Now, later court cases like Planned Parenthood v. Casey and Webster versus reproductive, like Planned Parenthood v. Casey and like Webster, they restrict abortion rights just a little bit, but not completely, not even close to completely. So abortion, Roe v. Wade opens it up, and later court cases affirm the right. They say, yeah, you still have the right to an abortion, but we're going to restrict it in these little ways. Okay, question.
Is this just like the case, I can't think of the name of it right now, but the cases where blacks get, because you have to have a certain % of people accept to a college, for instance.
Okay, she's talking about something around the same time. Actually, I think it's a little later in the 70s. It's called Bakke.
Yeah.
versus the California Board of Regents. That's the one where he was trying to get to medical school, and he didn't, because he didn't, the quota of white students was already filled. They said, look, you can have affirmative action, but there are certain ways you're not allowed to do it. Now, you had a hand up. You were about to ask about that one? Okay, so both abortion and affirmative action, I think I said it right. You've got the Supreme Court saying you can have it, but there are these little teensy tiny limits on how you do it. All right?
The Texas one?
Are there any others you can think of?
Texas versus somebody.
There are a few
What
involved
about
in Texas.
evolution?
What?
Oh, yeah.
The Scopes monkey trial. Now, keep in mind, that's not a Supreme Court case. That's a Tennessee case. It's still obviously important because it's about the teaching of evolution versus having evolution banned.
Okay.
What was that? Oh, they're in the, yeah, okay. That's in 1925. And even though Scopes lost the case, it became more acceptable to teach, it slowly becomes more acceptable to teach evolution in public schools.
So Scopes was for evolution.
Scopes is the guy who got arrested for teaching it, yes.
Oh, I know what you're talking.
What is the triple wall of privilege? What is the triple wall of privilege?
Triple wall of privilege?
Triple wall. I thought you were saying Chippewa.
That's what I'm referring to.
No, it's not just wood. The triple wall of privilege. Wilson's three enemies, so to speak. His three targets, all right? Number one, he thought the currency needed to be reformed and banking needed to be reformed. So later on, he would push for the creation of this new national bank. The Federal Reserve System is what it's called. Number two, he thought tariffs were too high. And so, in response, he pushes for the income tax, lowers tariff, raises the income tax. And the third is that the trusts, he thought, were too powerful. And so, he gets the Clayton Antitrust Act passed, which helps to bust even more trusts than before. But it protects the unions and it protects the farmers. All right, Wilson, very successful his first few years in office in terms of his domestic agenda, very successful. Progressives are finally getting almost everything they could have asked. Here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a little bit about World War I, a little bit about World War II, a little bit about the Cold War, okay? All right. First of all, let's do this. For each war, we're going to get the belligerents, in other words, the two sides. We're going to get why and when we entered the war and the result, okay? And we'll start from there and then we'll add more as we go along, okay? World War I begins in 1914. One side, the Allies, are, and remember, we don't join right off the bat, so we're going to add us to the list at the very end, okay? Britain, Russia, France. There are some others, but those are the big three. Britain, Russia, France, okay? Who?
Later.
Italy, okay. Yeah. And then we joined in 1917. The bad guys were the Central Powers. And the only one you really have to worry about, frankly, is
Japan?
No.
The Nazi? You know, I don't know.
Germany.
Yep, yep.
Germany's usually the bad guys.
Is Japan the next one?
That's in this
That'll be later,
Yep,
yes.
see? Yep, see? It's
Oh,
done.
okay. All right, now, we get involved in the war because, now granted, we're closer both geographically emotionally, financially, politically to Britain and Germany. But what prompts us to join the war was,
U-boats.
is
No,
there a
then we have-
is there a fancier term for that?
Unrestricted submarine warfare.
German unrestricted submarine warfare. Too often they were attacking our ships and ships with Americans on them with impunity, and we finally got sick of it and said, okay, Germany, we're gonna fight. Now, even though technically, there was an armistice at the end of the war instead of a surrender. That means there was a ceasefire. In real life, the Allies won World War I, okay? Germany is essentially forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles.
They pay for
Louder, please.
do they pay for the damage?
They get hit with all the debt. They've got to pay the reparations. Bless you. They lose all their colonies. Wilson promotes the 14 points, the Treaty of Versailles, and the League of Nations. But we never joined the League of Nations. Right? And that's going to lead to problems later on. In the following decade, there's a lot of effort put at disarmament, trying to make sure peace works out. Needless to say, it doesn't. There's going to be a World War II. Okay? And in fact, a lot of people argue that the failures to resolve the aftermath of World War I is what allows Germany to become powerful and remilitarize and leads to World War II. Okay? Now, World War II. Once again, we wait a while before jumping in. Allied powers, and again, we're the last to join. Who are the Allies in World War II? Once again, France, well, what's left of France, Britain, the USSR, Russia, China, even though they're getting their butts kicked most of the time,
Was Russia always?
and the United States entered in 1941 after what? Pearl Harbor. Alex, what's your question?
Was USSR always an allied power? Then they.
In both wars, well, in World War II, yes, they were an allied power. Now, say it again.
They started off on the Axis.
Yeah.
They weren't part of the Axis. They had a deal with Germany that neither was going to fight the other. But then Hitler stabbed Stalin in the back and the front, whatever you want to call it, and then Stalin fights against Hitler.
They're trying to stay equal or
Who?
neutral. America. They're trying to stay
Well,
like.
now here's a big difference. Here's an important difference. Did you hear what she asked?
No.
She just said, and America's trying to stay neutral right before we join the war. Not in World War II. In World War I, hold on. In World War I, we're trying to stay out of it. Some people want America to join the Allies. Some want us to join the Central Powers. But eventually we join the Allies because Germany keeps attacking us. In World War II, we did have laws that said we have to remain neutral, that are trying to keep us as neutral as possible. In real life, the people who wanted us to get into the war were supporting the Allies. So for World War II, the positions were either join with the Allies or stay out of the war. Not join with the Allies or join with the Axis. The Axis were very clearly the bad guys. Nonetheless, even though we have these neutrality laws in place, some Americans, most notably FDR, is trying to help out the Allies as much as possible. Kind of stretching the laws to help them when necessary. There's the cash and carry program, there's the destroyers for bases deal, there's the Atlantic Charter that shows moral support for Britain. But we don't actually get directly involved in the war until Pearl Harbor. So I mean, yeah, there were neutrality laws, but in World War II, we're a lot more biased in favor of the Allies before the war than we had been in World War I. All right? The Axis powers in World War II.
Germany,
Germany,
Japan,
Japan,
Italy.
Italy through most of the war. Until, you know, we overran Germany and we nuked Japan.
Italy gave up.
What?
And Italy gave up.
Italy gave up.
And Mussolini.
Now, after World War II, we're trying to fix the mistakes that we made after World War I, or at least not repeat them. After World War II, we're going to make that United Nations. We didn't join the League of Nations. We are going to join the United Nations. After World War II, after World War I, we tried to stay out of Europe's business. We signed peace treaties to try and limit naval armaments. After World War II, it's the exact opposite. We've got the Marshall Plan. We're going to form NATO. We're trying to keep communism from expanding. We're getting very involved in Europe. And we're building up militarily because there's the potential for another war, this time against Russia. We want to be prepared for it. Cold War goes on for 45 years, from 1945 until, you could argue, either 89 or 91. I think 91's a safer bet. There is never any outright fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, our satellite states, if you will, our partners, our allies, fight each other often. And sometimes we'll fight against an ally of the Soviets and they'll fight against an ally of ours.
Who was the president during the Cold War?
The presidents during the Cold War, you ready? Starting with the end of World War II, go.
Truman,
Truman,
Eisenhower,
Ike,
not Nixon, it's JFK,
John F. Kennedy,
Lyndon B. Johnson,
Johnson, Lyndon Johnson,
Nixon.
Nixon,
After Nixon is Ford,
Ford,
Jimmy Carter,
Reagan,
George H.W. Bush.
George H.W. Bush, and that's the end of the
Yeah.
and that's the end of the Cold War. So when you ask who's the president,
Yeah,
There's a lot of-
everybody was the president.
everybody was president. Everybody took a turn, yeah. But let's say this: the approaches are a little bit different. Truman, Ike, Johnson believe in containment. Keep the Soviets from spreading, even though they weren't exactly successful at it in all cases. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. Nixon's attitude is, yeah, we want to keep containing the Soviets, but we also want to approach détente, meaning, let's see if we can't have warmer relations with them. Reagan was a bit more assertive. Didn't believe in containment. Said, look, if we build up the military, if we stand up to the Russians, not just contain them, but seek to roll them back through economic means, through military means in some places, then the Soviets will wither and die. And that's exactly what happened. Again, it may have been happening anyways, if you ever study. There's not one. Are you heading out? All right, good luck. Remember, APUSH book under the pillow.
APUSH book in my lab. With a little light on.
Yeah.
Well, hey, look, like I told my kids, you got to make sure you get a good night's sleep tonight because your brain needs to be working tomorrow at least 6 hours.
Study until 9.
That little
Taylor?
book has to be read down the side.
I told my sister to come to the tank and she says drama room where the boring looking guy drones on monotone.
That's right. I'm not usually here though.
No, she saw you through the door.
Oh. Whatever. She gets in there. Wait, what grade is she in?
7th grade.
What?
7th.
Okay, so
She doesn't get F.
4 years till her F. I'll remember.
You'll be sorry.
Yeah. I'll remember. Anyways, look, there's not one specific treaty that you have to know for the end of World War II, but let's discuss what happens at the end. You have a series of conferences during the
Yeah.
war and at the end of the war. And I get the order backwards, I'll tell you right now. Casablanca, Tehran, Potsdam, and Yalta.
Can you take the test for me tomorrow? Just ask.
See that slow?
No.
Why?
You have all these conferences where they're talking about a number of things. They're talking about when to bring the Soviets into the war against Japan. They're talking about how to open up that Western Front and that Southern Front against Germany and Europe. Later on at these conferences, they start planning what to do with Germany after the war, and they come to the decision to break it up into quads. And that, of course, will eventually lead to the formation of a West and East Germany. They talk about the formation of the UN.
They talk about the Eastern European satellite states.
Well, there's not much to say about them because what happens to them?
They became satellite states.
They became satellite states of the Soviet Union. Basically, if it's east of,
Germany.
if it's east of Germany,
But not,
it's going to be owned by the Soviets, at least temporarily.
at least, like most are Greece and Turkey, in which case we don't let you have it.
Well, that too. Yugoslavia remains communist, but
They aren't under Stalin.
they're not under Stalin. And Austria, communist, not so much under Stalin. I may have misspoken about Austria, but the point is, pretty much the eastern part of Europe is the Eastern Bloc. They're behind the Iron Curtain. They're kind of screwed for the next few decades. Western Europe flourishes. It is democratic. It is capitalistic. They make money. Does that help?
When does the Berlin Wall go up?
So
When does the Berlin Wall go up?
Berlin Wall is first built in, now keep in mind, Berlin had been divided into sectors just after World War II. There had been the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, but the wall doesn't go up until 61, 62. Now why had it gone up? Who remembers? Go ahead, come on.
Keep people from going from the East Berlin to West Berlin.
Because if everybody leaves your city,
Then they can go and get on the country.
they can get out of the country. It starts to make you look bad, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to. I mean, if they were a problem, why not let them go? But it's kind of making the system look bad. It's making East Germany and East Berlin look bad. It's making the ideal of communism look bad. It seems to be weakening. So Berlin Wall, there are checkpoints. Travel between the two is possible, but very heavily restricted. And the wall's going to stand until November of '89, when they finally start breaking it down and punching holes in it.
Was this also around the same time where Israel had made some kind of, they had like started to be nice to each other? I think it was Israel
Who?
and Iran.
Oh, no.
It was some kind of country like that.
Israel and
I was about to say Egypt.
Egypt.
I was about to say.
Israel and Egypt signed the Camp David Accords in '79, so it's still much later. In fact, now you were comparing it to the Berlin Wall when it
No, I was saying, was it around the same time? I didn't know the dates.
It's years later. Israel and Egypt, they've been to war 3 times. Israel won 3 times. They had the Suez Crisis flare up. Then in '79, Egypt signed some peace treaty with Israel. Nowadays, of course, who knows what's going to happen there, because Mubarak's gone, and the military runs Egypt, and we were hoping it would be a benefit, but they don't seem willing to give up power anytime soon. One, two, okay? Come closer so you can hear, okay?
The Great Society with
The
LBJ.
Great Society, LBJ. Now, the war on poverty includes a lot of the economic stuff, so let's talk about the war on poverty part first. Mind if I stand up for a bit?
Good.
All right, war on poverty. What are some of the programs Wilson either creates or expands? Louder.
Medicare and Medicaid.
Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is health insurance, health payments for the elderly. Medicaid for the poor. You expand Social Security a bit. Some new education laws. The war on poverty is about attacking what he called the root causes of poverty. It's not just cash to the poor. It's hopefully building up their health and building up their educational levels so that they'll have the human capital to go out and be successful and eradicate poverty. And you can argue about whether it worked or not, but it was very expensive. And that was kind of it's bad, but it's bad. There's debate about how successful it's been, but what was not debatable at the time was that it was very expensive, and that combined with the Vietnam War helps contribute to economic trouble in the late 60s and the 70s, okay? But there are other components to the Great Society. LBJ was dramatically improving civil rights protections. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, he pushed for the 24th Amendment, which got rid of the poll tax. So those things combined, civil rights plus the war on poverty, Great Society. Okay. We're expanding the space program. All right. Deja,
What exactly is V-Day?
louder.
V-Day, what exactly is V-Day?
Where is
V-Day, I put September 2nd, 1945.
that was VJ Day. There's a VE Day and a VJ Day.
What is V-Day?
Those celebrate the end of World War II, VE in Europe. In fact, we just passed VE Day Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken. The war, it celebrates the end of the war in Europe with the fall of Germany, and the end of the war in the Pacific with Japan's surrender. Does that help? That's all those are.
Can you go through like the different like parties from like the beginning, like the changes?
Louder.
Can you go through the different parties like Democratic, Republican, like what they changed?
Okay, now keep in mind that the parties we have today, the Democrats and Republicans, there are a lot of significant differences between them now and them 150 years ago, okay? But, let's go block by block, okay? The first party system, Democratic Republicans, who were led by
Jefferson?
Thomas Jefferson, James Madison later on, James Monroe later on. Heading out?
Sorry.
That's okay. Good luck. The Democratic Republicans were mostly where? They're in the southern states. They're in the west. It's a lot of farmers. What else can we say about them? They were generally opposed to Hamilton's plan at first. At first, they believed in a very strict, narrow construction of the Constitution, interpretation of the Constitution. Does that help? Okay. Now, they were opposed to the Democratic Republicans were opposed to the Federalists, who were led by
John Adams.
who?
Adams.
More important than John Adams, even though he was president, was
Hamilton?
Alexander Hamilton, right? You could argue that George Washington was a Federalist. He never joined a political party. He just happened to agree with them on almost everything. John Marshall will be on the Supreme Court for 34 years. He's a Federalist. While they lasted, they were up in New England. Okay. While they lasted, they were up in New England. They were pro-Hamilton's plan, meaning pro-bank, pro-tariff. The Dem-Reps were anti-tariff. Pro-excise tax, pro-assumption, pro-funding and par. Pro-Britain, where the Democratic Republicans were pro-France. And eventually the Federalists are going to go bye-bye. With Hamilton dying, The glue that holds them together is gone. They're kind of hemmed in New England while the rest of the country is growing very, very quickly. The agricultural sectors are growing, so that's ripe for Democratic and Republican expansion. And with the Hartford Convention, the Federalists embarrassed themselves out of existence. There's going to be an era of good feeling where there's just one political party, the Democratic Republicans. Doesn't last too long. Second party system comes after the after the corrupt bargain election, after the Democratic Republicans split up. The second party system is Democrats, very similar to the Democratic Republicans, like Jackson, like Van Buren, like Calhoun. And on the other side are the National Republicans, who later on evolved into the Whigs. Now, the Whigs hold a lot of the same positions that the Federalists did, but the difference is both the Whigs and the Democrats are now all over the country. Now, there are differences in both parties depending on where you are in the country, but both the Whigs and the Democrats are all over the country. Okay? Famous Whigs: Clay, Webster. Those are the two big ones. William Henry Harrison, I guess, technically was a Whig, but he died very early on. Zachary Taylor, same thing. And again, they have a lot of the same ideas as the Federalists did. Does anybody remember, this may be trivial, but does anybody remember why they went with the name Whigs? Yeah, they named themselves after the Whig Party in Parliament, but do you remember why they chose that name?
Just stick it to the Democrats?
Which Democrat in particular?
Jackson.
Remember how much a lot of people really hated Jackson and thought he was acting like a king? And the Whigs had been the party back in England who opposed the monarch, they opposed the idea that the monarch could do whatever he wanted, right? So they kind of borrowed that nickname. Anyways, the Whigs are going to last until the mid-1850s, then they'll collapse as an organization and they're replaced by the Republicans. The Republicans, at first, are essentially the Northern Whigs plus the Free Soilers plus a handful of know-nothings. So they're pro-tariff. They want the federal government paying for internal improvements. They'd like to make another national bank if they can. They are anti-slavery and then later abolitionists. What do I mean again by anti-slavery? Louder, please. They don't want it to spread. They oppose the expansion of slavery. Now, for the rest of the 19th century, for the rest of the 1800s, the Republicans are going to be mostly Northern Party, and they'll have some influence in the Midwest and on the West Coast. The Democrats are a Southern and Western Plains Party. Stereotypically, the Republicans are the party of the rich, the Democrats of the poor. The Republicans are the party of big business, the Democrats are the party of unions and labor. And I want to change the subject. All right, that's a decent start, sure.
Which ethnicities did the quota system?
Speak up.
Which ethnicities did the quota system discriminate against? Or did it?
Are you talking about the Quota Act?
Yeah.
Okay. They designed it in such a way that they could say it didn't discriminate against anybody, because all they did was say, hey, look at the census, look at how many people were coming over in this year, in this particular year, 3% of them. But the thing is, they picked a year where there weren't a whole lot of Southern or Eastern European immigrants coming over. So the simple answer to your question is, they're targeting Eastern and Southern Europeans. Need to get up and stretch or something? You guys, if somebody needs to take a walk or something, come back. I will take absolutely no offense. That's Ashton Coker, right? C-O-K-E-R?
Yep.
You're in my first period class?
Oh, man.
Okay. Coker. Seriously, if anybody needs to get up and stretch, that's perfectly fine. All right, let's keep going. Deja,
What was the triple wall for
go. She hadn't gotten here yet.
No, what was it? Oh.
Speak up.
Okay, it was the three things that Wilson was most against. He didn't like the current currency and bank system, so he set up the Federal Reserve System in place of that. He also opposed high tariff.
Started to get rid of silver with there was a law passed 1873, so just after, a few years after the Civil War, 8 years later, and that was called the crime of 73, because the farmers and the miners, the poor guys were so upset that they weren't using silver anymore. There was so much outrage and uproar that the government said a couple years later, okay, we'll put a little bit more silver in the circulation, but just a little bit, just a few $million a year. All right? Now, by 1900, with McKinley's re-election, we're virtually done with silver. We're on an almost exclusively gold standard. That'll last until, time out before you go, and I should have said this to the other two. How do you plan to label this?
I don't know, how should I?
Something memorable. How about Paxon APUSH Review?
Yeah, because I do
Okay.
want to watch that.
And then end the year, Paxon APUSH Review 2012.
Will
Okay.
it be like on YouTube as well? Because I don't have a Facebook.
I'm assuming you're going to, you put it on YouTube last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what would it be again?
Look for Paxon APUSH 2012.
I'll text it to you.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll text it to you.
all right?
Thank you.
All
Hi,
right.
Maya.
Good luck.
Thanks, Coach.
Good night's sleep. Light breakfast. Book under the pillow. All right. Does that help? Now, we officially finally go off gold in 1971. But in reality, we were kind of weaning ourselves off gold starting in the 30s with FDR and the gold confiscation.
And the cross of gold speech.
The Cross of Gold speech, that was your buddy William Jennings Bryan, the populist
Silver.
Democrat, going around telling everybody that gold would be the ruination of the country, that we needed silver. And nobody listened. Yes, ma'am, Darrell.
What was with all deliberate speed?
Where did you find that?
It was part of something, but I can't remember which.
I think it was had to do with desegregating the schools.
It was part of the Brown decision that public education, separate, but that when it came to public education, separate is inherently unequal, automatically unequal. And that the schools should be desegregated with all deliberate speed. As an aside, that's kind of an oxymoron, because deliberate means taking your time, getting it right, which is the opposite of speed. But what they meant was, by deliberate speed, you could argue that they meant purposefully going fast to desegregate. Now, did it happen? It was really slow. And we're not going to see real desegregation until the Johnson administration 10 years later. Although in fairness to Ike is the one who sent the troops down to Arkansas to make them admit those young black ladies to the high school, to Central High School.
Korean War.
What about it?
When was it?
Okay, our involvement in the Korean War begins in 1950 through 1953, right? Yes, that's right. And it begins because the North invades the South, We're trying to resist the expansion of communism. The UN and the United States refer to it as a police action because it's a civil war that we want to get in. We don't want to declare war, but we send the army over there. This also ends up in a draw, but the good news is the already communist part of Korea. And folks, in this discussion of Korea, forgive me if I slip up and say Vietnam. I'm not talking about Vietnam, I'm talking about Korea, okay? At least we could say that North Korea did not take South Korea. And we put up military bases there to keep defending it. There's a demilitarized zone to this day. The war, 55,000 troops dead in a relatively short 3.5-year period. The Red Chinese were backing North Korea. What helps to bring the war to an end is when Eisenhower basically tells the North Koreans and the Chinese that if they don't stop fighting, we're going to start nuking them. I don't know how publicly well known that was, but that's what brings them to the bargaining table for the armistice. Deja.
What is the Hay, B-U-N-D-A-U?
I got it. Hay is John Hay, our Secretary of State at the time. This is around 1901 or 1900. And Felipe Brunel Varilla. That guy's the president of further south, Panama. That is the treaty that authorizes us to begin constructing and to operate the Panama Canal.
When did we, with Cuba, what was it called when we, not Cuba, but I think it was Russia, when we said we weren't gonna like build more missiles and you don't build more missiles and all that called?
Well, you could be talking about a few things, but you said this was with reference to Cuba.
Yeah, all that Cuban missiles.
Okay, remember the Cuban missiles? Castro had just taken over in Cuba. We had tried invading, well, there was a failed invasion of Cuba. And because Castro didn't want to make sure the U.S. never invaded again, he tried to become buddies with Khrushchev, who was the head of the USSR at the time. We found out that they were starting to build missile sites in Cuba. We don't like that because they're very close to the United States. We blockade the island. There could have been a war for about 2 weeks. People thought there would be a war, a nuclear war. I mean, my parents are old enough to remember that. They were in high school when it happened. Well, Dad was in high school, Mom was about to be, and it was the sort of thing where they were like, look, you go to sleep not knowing if you were going to wake up the next morning. I mean, that's how close people felt to the Civil War, to a nuclear war. They calmed down, they chilled out, and the agreement was they would not build the missile sites in Cuba. In exchange, we
removed our missiles from.
hold on a second, because that was kind of kept quiet. The first promise, the biggest promise was we would never invade Cuba. But we also promised to
Remove missiles from Turkey.
from Turkey.
You do that 6 months after the fact, though, so it doesn't look like it.
Yeah, we didn't want to look weak. That's something politicians will do. If they make a concession, then we'll make them look weak. They wait a while for things to calm down and then do it later, so that people don't think, oh, you're being weak. Another example, Reagan has this very tough image, very aggressive, assertive image. But there was an occasion after the where was it? Lebanon. After the Marine barracks were bombed in Lebanon in 82 or 83. He waited a few weeks and then pulled the rest of our Marines out. Because we don't want to get them killed over Lebanon. They won't show us Lebanon.
You don't know that.
and the Lebanese girl left. Is she the one who's part Lebanese?
Yes.
Deja,
What was the Elk Hills scandals?
louder please.
What was the Elk Hills scandals?
You got me. Where is that? What number on the term sheet?
Number 446.
Is there a time period on it?
I put 1922. You put slash teapot.
Okay. Teapot Dome I can explain in great detail. But those
Are they
two,
the same?
they're related. They happen under the same guy's administration. President Harding is well known for the scandals that occurred while he was president. Okay? And for his failure to adequately address the scandals. Teapot Dome, Elk Hills, they go together because they should remind you that there's all that scandal in the Harding administration. Now again, I can't speak to Elk Hills in particular, but the Teapot Dome scandal, Teapot Dome is like this national not wildlife, it's a nature reserve. And you're allowed to drill for oil in some of these nature reserves, which sounds kind of weird, but you're allowed to do it as long as you get
Permission.
permits from the feds. And what was happening, like Albert Fall and these guys in the Harding administration, they were illegally selling permits. They were taking bribes to give out these permits. That's a scandal. Does that help?
Sacco and Vanzetti.
Sacco and Vanzetti. This is the mid-1920s. These are two relatively recent Italian immigrants. They are both anarchists. They, let me preface this by saying, from what I know of the case, I am absolutely convinced they are guilty, but that's me talking.
Didn't they get executed?
Yes.
Yeah.
They killed a paymaster. That's the guy who works for your company, handing out the cash when people collect their paychecks or when people collect their wages. Okay. But the trial itself was very unsatisfactory in the sense that it didn't seem to be a legitimately conducted trial. Their supporters felt that it was a sham, felt that they were not provided an adequate, honest defense. They ended up getting executed. There was this anti-immigrant, very nativist atmosphere around it. This is during a time when there's a lot of pushback against immigration. And so they're executed. But a lot of people sympathized with them and said, look, they're being blamed for a crime they didn't commit. They got a crappy trial, if you'll pardon the expression. And they're being scapegoated because they're foreigners and because they're anarchists. And so it kind of gets wrapped up in the Red Scare. Okay? Now that's why we have to know it for APUSH, but just to be as historically complete as I can be in the next 15 seconds, from everything I've read about this thing, it turns out a lot of the people who supported them and testified on their behalf would flat out admit years later that they were lying and that they were inventing testimony to try and exonerate these two. They're really undercutting their position. I mean, okay, so I'm supposed to believe you that they got an unfair trial because you lied on their behalf. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they did. But that's not the standard that we want to use in our justice system, is it? We want guilty beyond a reasonable doubt after a fair trial in front of a jury of your peers and all those constitutional protections. And the real scandal, the real issue from APUSH's perspective and from AP government's perspective is that it doesn't seem like they got that fair trial. There's a lot of argument about whether they did. Monique and
I just want to know the date that was.
For what?
That trial.
25-ish. Maybe somebody's got something more precise.
What was the gag rule or something?
Okay, this is 1836 or so. Starting in about 1830 with Nat Turner's Rebellion, the South has become extremely defensive about slavery. Okay, so now the North is starting to become, the North is starting to become more anti-slavery. The abolitionist movement is slowly growing. So the South, in order to try to protect slavery, they say, okay, how about this? No more talking about slavery in Congress. And if you can't talk about slavery in Congress, you can't vote on bills that would ban slavery, right? Now, eventually the gag rule was repealed, but it's an especially shameful moment in our history because the whole point of Congress is that you should be able to talk about anything in Congress so you can figure out what laws we're supposed to make. In fact, part of the Constitution says, this is kind of an aside, part of the Constitution says that you cannot be arrested for anything you say while you are a representative or senator in Congress. Because they need to be free to talk about the issues that are important. And then here comes this gag resolution, pushed mostly by Southern Democrats. Here's this gag resolution that says, no more talking about slavery. It's just a gross offense to the spirit of the First Amendment. Does that help? Now they're going to get rid of it pretty quickly, but it's just one more reminder of how ugly things were getting between North and South over the matter of slavery. That's right, your question was about the time, the date of the second executive trial. Sure.
Free soilers.
Louder?
Free soilers.
The earliest appearance of the Free Soil Party might have been the mid-1840s, maybe a little bit earlier. But Free Soilers, their number one issue, they had three or four very important issues, but issue number one was no expansion of slavery. All right? To the where? Where? Which is what direction?
West.
Which is to the west, okay? Right? That's the most important issue. Now, some of the free soilers favored that position for moral and ethical reasons, but also many, if not most of them, favored that position for economic reasons. Because wherever slavery was, the harder it was for poor and middle-class whites to get more work, right? So that's one of their issues. Another issue is as we get closer to the 1850s and 60s, they start pushing for free land grants out west. They called them homesteads. They wanted the federal government to give away land to people as long as they improved the value of the land somehow, okay? They were opposed to the gag rule. Free soil, free men, free land, free speech. Now, they will become an integral component of the Republican coalition. Do you guys remember, everybody here is mine, right? And you guys might remember this from last year. You guys remember when I showed you the Free Soil poster? And then I showed you the Republican poster, and they were almost identical. They just had different people on them in different colors.
Yeah.
Remember, the Free Soilers are going to join together with Northern Whigs to form the Republican Party, and it's a purely Northern party.
What was the gas fee affair?
She's asking about the Gaspee affair. It may be pronounced Gaspé, I don't know, but I'm going to say Gaspee. Are you done? Oh, no, okay. All right. Study, rest, study. No sleeping during the exam.
All right.
This is 1772 in Deja. In spirit, it is very similar to the Boston Tea Party, where we're getting a little bit violent and we're doing property damage in order to protest British policies.
Is this the one where they set it on fire instead of
There was a ship that ran aground, and they dressed up as Indians and kicked everybody off the ship and burned it in protest. That's exactly right.
That wasn't a Gatsby affair.
That was the Gatsby affair.
So, Boston Tea Party was when they threw tea overboard.
Yeah,
Okay.
nobody burned anything.
Okay.
If they had burned the tea, I mean, look, if it's in the water, at least tea is supposed to go in water. All right? Right? If you burn the tea, I'm a big tea drinker. I side with the British there.
What was the, next one, the year
This is the late 1790s, okay? This is a time when we're getting really upset with France. And there is some talk of potentially going to war with France, right? Now, at one point, we want us running for re-election, 1972, all right? As far as there's an organization working on his behalf called the Committee to Re-elect the President. It gets the nickname CREEP. CREEP has some guys who got the nickname the Plumbers to break into the Watergate Hotel where the Democrats had their headquarters for the 1972 election and see what sort of dirt they could dig up on the Democrats. Eventually they get caught, okay? They go to jail. Nixon tries to cover it up. Payoffs. He uses the CIA to spy on the FBI. He messes around with the investigation, tries to keep it from going forward as much as possible. Is this helping? And eventually, when it is revealed that there's a taping system, an audio taping system in the White House, specifically in the Oval Office, that pretty much irrefutably links him to the Plumbers, to the Watergate scandal. He's about to get impeached. He finally resigns. If he'd stuck around another month or so, he would have been impeached. Now again, they were going after him because
He lied. He
he
tried to cover
lied,
it up.
because he was involved in the cover-up.
Yes.
But his argument was, who was trying to get him to give up the tapes?
So,
Another branch of government. Congress was trying to get him to give up the tapes, right? And he said, wait a minute, I'm the president, I'm equal, I am a co-equal branch of government. I'm on the same level as you. You can't make me do it. There is a list of things you can do to me, that's not on the list. The fancy term for that is executive privilege. There's a lawsuit, it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, look, buddy, you've got to hand over the tapes because while executive privilege does exist, you're trying to use it to cover your butt. We're not, this is, executive privilege is like talking about policy, talking about foreign policy, talking about tax and stuff like that. You're just trying to, protect yourself in a criminal investigation. That's not what executive privilege is for. So the Supreme Court makes him hand the case, the Supreme Court makes him hand the tapes over. Courtney, you heading out?
Yes.
Good night's sleep, light breakfast, pageant under the pillow. You too.
All that flowery language.
Study, study, study.